Fred, speaking as an old neuroscientist, I was taught that everything that makes any sense about mentality, sensory, motor, thinking is based upon neurons, very physical, very material, which is very widespread among neuroscientists. Do you think the person is all material?
In fact, I think the person has nothing to do with that. All of that is necessary in order to have a recollection or something going on. Just as if you want to drive from here to the next place, wherever that happens to be, you need a car that has a motor and spark plugs and everything else. But the driver, without the driver, that car is going nowhere. A body can function electrically, neuronically, all kinds of magical ways, all kinds of normal physical ways. There's nobody home. So the person who's home seems to be something outside of that, something spiritual.
How do you say that? How do you get that? Because you don't see it in any way. Every brain function, every mental function can be imaged, can be sensed, and we don't understand all of it, but we certainly understand a great deal, and increasingly so. What confidence do you have there's something else in there?
Well, there's a number of things. I think the first thing is, what about the fundamental level of the material world? Is it the fundamental level? If materiality was fundamental, I would agree that neurophysiology should explain everything. But if we, as we understand the world today, materiality is not fundamental, that there's this underlying, there's this basement, this invisible dream, if you want to call it, that's more fundamental, then why should we assume that anything as subtle as consciousness should only be based upon anything material? In fact, there's no evidence to prove there's anybody like a person inside of us. Inside of me, there's no Fred Allen Wolf. There's no Robert Kuhn inside of this body over here. But you call it a Robert Kuhn, and I call it a Fred Allen Wolf. What does it mean?
Well, it may mean that this is just the way our brains represent our image of the world and how we do it. I mean, you're imagining some ghost in the machine that operates it based on what evidence?
Well, what evidence do you have that the brain is operating the machine?
Well, I see electrical activity when I see eye movements. You can trace it throughout the brain at different levels. A whole lot of granted correlations, but we don't know everything. But every sensory, every kind of thinking kind of process, you can map in brain function in different ways.
It's as I said, it's true that there is a mechanical something going on. There is definitely that. But there's not clear evidence that from all of that going on, that anything like a word being spoken with this emphasis rather than that emphasis, or in this language rather in that language, in Deutsche Sprache, or in Français, or in English, or in Evrit. Where does that come from? Where does this thought come from? Are you telling me that this thought, totally original, never heard before, never spoken before in this way, has arisen from random firings of the brain?
Well, look,
it seems nonsense to me.
It's a question, some would say, of computation. If you have, 10 to the 15th, no chance. If you have 10 to the 20th computations per second, or some number, at some point you will get that by complexity. But are you looking, based on your background, to quantum mechanics as the way to see a different approach to the world, where consciousness has a different basis in reality?
I'm looking to quantum mechanics as it applies to the brain and nervous system, certainly. Because when I look at the way neurons work, I come to the conclusion that vesicle emission and all that stuff is probabilistic and seems to fit very well into a picture that's consistent with quantum mechanics, with quantum physics. And I'm not the only one thinking like this. A number of scientists are thinking that way. There are, of course, counter-arguments, and I understand those counter-arguments. It's not clear which is the way.
If you're basing your argument on quantum mechanics is such a fundamental level, the question is, does it have any impact in a warm, wet brain, as opposed to just something that gets averaged together many, many orders of magnitude lower than where meaningful activity occurs in a biological nervous system.
It could very well. It depends on what the communicating, quote unquote, mechanism might be. The way we normally think about it in a mechanical way is that something has to, some kind of particle, like a photon or something, has to go from here to there. And if the thing is noisy sending it out, then this thing going out is noisy. And people think that way. But if we're talking about quantum mechanics, then we're talking about another kind of quote unquote communication. It's called quantum entanglement. And quantum entanglement indicates that the brain may be a very complex quantum entangled quote unquote instrument. And that's why there seems to be so much diversity in brains, so much diversity in intelligence, because of the different ways in which these very complicated entanglements can arise and dissipate.
Is quantum mechanics critical for your conviction that the person is not material, that there's something fundamentally different than the material world that is the person?
There's something very fundamental that I would like to explain about how quantum mechanics may apply here that is not being taken into consideration by any of the classical neurophysiological models. What is called the observer effect, or if you will, it's the ability by which one can move or change or cause a series of events to occur, such as the next word after this word after that word, by intent. And intent in this case would be the collapsing of the wave function along a given trajectory, which cannot be explained in a mechanistic way. We call this the quantum Zeno effect. It has different names, but what it basically says is if you observe a quantum system a number of times, you can actually alter the path by which that system evolves, so that evolution is not just a random process, but is actually a directed process through this observer effect.
Look, I've heard that, and I think it's very interesting, but that of itself does not create a spiritual entity that inhabits my body. You could have that type of system working in a very materialistic world.
Except for one thing. Where is the observer? See, the problem is if you do everything mechanically, then everything would operate in a mechanical way, and there would be no shaping. There would be no what's called collapsing of the wave function. There would be no nothing would be moving in that direction. Nothing would be moving in a willful way.
So you need an observer.
You need an observer.
But does that observer have to be spiritual, made up of a different kind of stuff?
It seems evident to me that it can't be material, because a material substance. But when materials interact, when atoms interact, when things interact, they follow the laws of quantum mechanics, which predicts possibilities multiplying into possibilities. But when an observer interacts with what's going on, it narrows the field down so that certain possibilities no longer occur. So I would conclude from this that since we need this process, which cannot be explained by one material interacting with another, since we need that, this process itself, the thing which is making the process, can't be matter. If it is, it would just be multiplication. If it was matter, it would just be multiplication of probability after probability, as according to what quantum mechanics says. But if there is a shaping, a narrowing, a focus that's forming, then there has to be a non-material focuser present. I call that spirit.